Amy?
Yep, I'm ready.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is our first Zoom program of 2023. My name is Martha Zadowski, and I'm one of the friends of the Pope Farm Conservancy. I'm really glad you could be with us tonight. We have a great program. What I would like you to do is mute yourself during the program. And during the program, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. And we will take questions at some point during the presentation, maybe at the end. We will record the program because we had 170 people register and we can only handle 100. So if you want to see it again, or if you know someone that couldn't get in tonight, the recording will be posted on the Friends of Pope Farm website later tonight. I wanted to talk for a couple of minutes about the Friends before I introduce our speaker. The Friends of Pope Farm Conservancy is a group dedicated to preserving the beauty of the Conservancy. And I would encourage all of you to become members, or if you are currently members, to make sure that you renew your membership, because there are many benefits of being a member. You receive our monthly email updates that talks about what's going on in the Conservancy and upcoming programs. You also get our magazine, which comes out a few times every year. You get invited to the annual picnic, which is really a fun event in August. Of course, you're invited to all the programs throughout the year. And then this year, we have something new. We're going to have a photo contest for spring and summer photos of the Conservancy. And as a member, you can participate in the photo contest. And lastly, if you are a member, you're going to feel really good because you're supporting a wonderful, wonderful place in Dane County. So I encourage all of you to become a member or renew your membership. In terms of our program tonight, I already mentioned we're going to use the chat box for questions, and you should mute yourself during the presentation. Let's see, is there anything else I wanted to say? I think that's it. So now let me introduce Dr. Amy Rosebrough. I got to know Amy at the Conservancy. Amy is a friend of the Conservancy as well. And I've learned so much from her over the years about the archaeology at the Conservancy, about Native American settlements, about native gardening. She has a wealth of information. Amy, in her day job, is being an archaeologist for the Wisconsin State Historical Society. She received her PhD in 2010, and she's recognized as a leading expert on effigy mounds in Wisconsin. She's also an expert in many other fields of archaeology. She's a member, as I mentioned, of the Friends, and in that role with the Friends, she gives talks and leads tours, and she also maintains the native gardens that we have at the Conservancy. In 2021 and 2022, 2 ancient canoes were discovered in Lake Mendota. And Amy and other archaeologists and members of the Ho-Chunk and Bad River tribes worked to recover those ancient canoes. And Amy is going to talk to us about that discovery, about what has happened since they were discovered, and what the future might hold. So Amy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Martha. I will make another plug for the Friends group. Just a wonderful, wonderful place. And when I'm not out on the lake helping look for canoes, I like to spend it at Pope Farm at the gardens, as Martha said. So I am an archaeologist, as she mentioned, with the Wisconsin Historical Society and the State Archaeology and Maritime Preservation Office. And my general focus is land archaeology. I had rarely been near the boat that the Society owns, the Dawn Treader. And while I count the divers as friends, I never really thought I would participate in anything that involved that much water. So this has been a real hoot for me. So let's get to the story. Let me see. Can this go forward? There we go. So Lake Mendota. People tend to think of the Great Lakes when they think of shipwrecks and fascinating maritime history in Wisconsin. At Lake Superior, Edmund Fitzgerald, Lake Michigan. And right here at Madison, the capital city, we have lakes of our own, Lake Mendota. And people think it's just a lake. You go out, you fish, you sunbathe next to it. You might swim a little bit if the algae is not too bad. And it's often overlooked, its role in history here. But this is Tamara Thompson. She's our lead diver here at the Society. She will tell you different. And she's really the star of the show. So I'm going to mention her a lot. She also helps with a dive shop. Cohen's a dive shop on the south shore of Lake Mendota along University Avenue called Diversions. I'll plug her a little bit here. And spends more of her time underwater than she probably does in the open air. She just loves diving and swimming. And she has been all over Lake Mendota and helps with documenting, again, our Great Lakes shipwrecks, and spent about a year or so driving a grad student around Wisconsin. He had decided to study dugout canoes and was going to museums and historical societies looking to see what they had, but he had just gotten his license. He wasn't very comfortable driving yet, so he asked her if she would go along. So she spent a lot of time sitting and watching him measure dugouts. And then one day, she's swimming along, as she does, and looking for things like this, the Davidson speedboat. Mostly she's just chasing fish. Again, there are shipwrecks in Lake Mendota. This is one that we know about before. Homemade speedboat. It's just a little wooden launch that somebody jury-rigged a outboard motor to in 1929. Didn't work really well. It sank and killed 5 people. But it's down there just off the boat launch off Marshall Park. And so she's looking around, then runs halfway through her air with her partner. And then that leads to this, what we call Discovery Day. June 7th, 2021, she's down there chasing fish along the wall, seeing what she could see. She's testing out a little scooter, which is kind of like holding on to a low-powered torpedo. It pulls you around. Her dive partner stops, signals that there's the halfway point. They need to turn around and go back to the shop. She looks down and sees this. She's been looking at dugout canoes for a year or so, and so she knows what she sees. And it's hard to read. This is a picture she took at the moment. This is her notebook. And you see the canoe in the background behind it. And she has written dugout canoe, exclamation mark. And she shows it to her partner. Her partner actually has to go back and pick up her boyfriend for a basketball game, so not interested. So away they go. I get a phone call. I'm sitting at my desk typing and thinking, well, it's a really nice day, but I really need to catch up on work. And she calls and says, Amy, come out on the boat. I found something. Like, what do you mean you found something? No, you got to come out on the boat with me. Come on, do it. Like, oh, it is a lovely day. I'll probably regret it if I don't get to spend a day on the boat. Sure. So out we go. And she says, I think I found a dugout canoe. And there are these weird rocks in it. So here's, again, Discovery Day photo of this weird little pile of rocks in what she believes is the canoe. So I go out, she goes down, I'm sitting on the boat, looking around, watching her bubbles, because I do not dive. And up she comes with these rocks, lays them out on the edge of the Dawn Treader, and I am instantly just puzzled as all can be. She shows me the photo, and it does look like a canoe to me. She's the expert. I'm not sure what the rocks are, though. Some of them are obviously humanly modified. Some of them appear just to be normal flat rocks, the kind you might pick up on a beach, except they're all flat. They're not rounded like you get in a beach here. They haven't been tumbled by glaciers. They're all about the same size. They're all about the same shape. They're all about the same thickness, but they don't make much sense to me. So I say, okay, put them back. She's like, fine, a little confused, but she does. So down they go. And overnight, I'm thinking, what could these be? And suddenly realized that this is an artifact type that we don't see that much in Wisconsin on land. They're very rare and they're hard to recognize because they are so minimally modified. They're called net weights or net sinkers. And they are roughly flat pieces of stone or round stone that have been grooved or notched or just natural cobbles that are picked up that are already the right size and shape. And they're used to hold down the bottom edge of a gill net or a pond net, or to weight down a line with a float, for example, for doing trot lines. And they're part of fishing gear. Like, okay, you have a canoe. You have fishing gear still in the canoe. This seems important. So here they are. To date, the only pre-contact fishing materials ever found in association with a dugout canoe, and they don't look like much, are 7 little net sinkers. And you can see some of them have natural notches. The one in the lower left is my favorite. We call it the Wisconsin sinker, because if you flip it around, it's roughly the shape of Wisconsin. One side is sort of naturally notched, and then someone has chipped the other side to put the opposing notch in. Others, like the one in the middle of the lower row, are absolutely natural, came pre-notched, you could say. And some, like the upper right, are notched or chipped and worked almost all the way around, even though the notches are very shallow. So this is a true assemblage, and they were piled in the canoe and left there, and the canoe sank, was submerged somehow, and everything stayed right where it was left. And then that's where this guy comes in. This is Jim Skibo. When this canoe was discovered, we were in between state archaeologists. So no one was really in charge of our program per se. And so when Jim arrives, one of the first things he does, he asks us, is there anything interesting, anything I should know about? I'm like, well, Jim, there's this canoe. Little did he know this was going to kind of overtake his life very shortly. He said, we should get a date. We said, we agree. So Tammy went back down. She got a sliver of wood off of it, came back up. We sent it out for analysis. And then surprises occurred. I had thought, all right, maybe if we are really, 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 really lucky, this canoe might be 300-400 years old. 500 would be beyond our wildest dreams. And then the date came back. And it is about 1,200 years old. And I hit the floor at this point, because that time period is my specialty. These are the folks that I study. In Wisconsin, they're known as the effigy builders. They're late woodland people known for building burial mounds in the shapes of animals and spirits and sculpting their burial mounds. And I did my dissertation on these folks. And there's a canoe that they made, that they used right offshore. You know, I was in the boat over it. Tammy's touched it. I've looked at the samples. Waiting. The oldest canoe that we know of in the Midwest, possibly the oldest in the US completely. Turns out Florida has some older. Florida has more. I do understand we have some Florida people here, so I'll give you guys a little credit there. But as far as the Midwest goes, this is the oldest one that we know of, and the only one in the US that comes with its fishing gear still inside. So here's the timeline. This is Wisconsin, 14,000 years of history in Wisconsin. And if you superimpose our date on, it falls again right in the effigy mound period, which is, for an archaeologist, pretty recent. Everyone else says 1,200 years, that's so old. It's a little old. It's amazingly old for wood, definitely. Which gives us a problem. Wood that is submerged for a really, really long time in water begins to not be wood anymore. Water gets in, it degrades the cellular structure. The lignin and cellulose that are holding the cell walls apart from each other and providing stability begin to degrade. And soon after a while, the water is the only thing that's keeping the wood from kind of collapsing in on itself. If you take wood out of the water and don't treat it in any way, just let the water dry out, the entire thing will crumble to dust and collapse. So the canoe is down there. It's been exposed to sunlight, to zebra mussels, to microorganisms, to view from other divers, recreational divers who might not realize what they've seen and might damage it. There are ships, boats dropping anchor in that area. We realized, okay, the canoe is not only old, it's in danger. We talked to experts and they said, if you leave it there, it's going to degrade very quickly. The only reason it was preserved is because it's been buried, sealed away all this time. Something has exposed it and done so recently. One end, in fact, had already started to degrade. So we have to recover it if we're going to save it, but we also have to figure out a way to keep it from collapsing in on itself and drying out. So Jim didn't think he was going to have this as be one of his duties, but it turns out he's a woodworker in his spare time. He immediately got to work building what we call Wisconsin's strongest vat. Okay. Flying buttresses on all sides. This thing was going to make it was not going to leak at all. We were putting this in a room in our museum storage facility that also contains things like the Wienermobile, the first Culver sign. So very important things that can't get wet. So we made sure that this tank is never, ever going to leak. So here's Jim doing work, and we all got involved at some point. Here's Tammy, she's testing out the initial lining here, a little exhausted. We double lined it after that. So no water is escaping this tank. And then out we went. By this point, it was November. It was getting very, very cold. You can see from our clothing that the air temperature is approaching freezing. The water temperature is still quite nice in the 50s, but the air itself is very cold. We rigged up some dredges with the idea that there might be additional artifacts, for example, copper fish hooks or boned fish hooks, harpoons around it that had spilled out of the canoe, maybe even fragments of netting if we were very, very lucky, part of a paddle. So we did some initial excavation around it using this dredge. Water comes up, goes through a screen, any artifacts or materials are caught. The main problem we had was it was so cold that the hoses kept breaking and dousing us with very large geysers. And at one point we almost set the Dawn Treader on fire, but we don't need to get into that. Okay, just, do you smell smoke? Oh, boat's smoldering a little. In the end, we after a day or so of doing this and getting wet and charring things, we realized nothing was coming up. So there really were no artifacts around the canoe. So we were able to relax a little bit after this. After a lot of logistics work, and I mean a lot, we got a team of volunteers together. By this point, a film crew had been told to follow us around by our leadership, the Purple Onion crew, great people. So watch for a film forthcoming on this. Dane County divers had volunteered some of their time to assist us with the recovery and their boat as well. The Dawn Treader is a good little vessel, but not completely equipped for something of this magnitude. Other divers, media had been alerted, tribal partners had been consulted and invited down, and the day approached. It was below freezing that morning, very cold. I was assigned to the beach to kind of corral the media at this point, and then the dive team, the people who know how to get in the water, out they went. So this is Dane County Sheriff's boat back behind the Dawn Treader, and you can see Jim leaning over the side here helping, I believe that's Caitlin's aunt in, one of our other divers at the time. The dive team provided support, additional lifting assistance, and the idea was that we would go down, secure the canoe, which had been freed from sediment at this point, use lift bags to bring it up just below the surface, and then the dive team would swim in with it, towing it behind their vessel, which could go much slower than ours. And so here it is on the lift bags, just under the surface. You see the yellow lift bags bringing it nearly in, everyone kind of swarming around it. It's escort. It took about an hour and a half to get to shore. They had to re-rig some stuff as the bottom got shallower. And what we did not anticipate was that during this process, dog walkers would come to the park. They saw cameras set up. They saw people standing around and gathering, and they started asking, what's going on? And then someone would say, they're bringing up a 1,200-year-old canoe. Look, you can see them out there. They're coming towards the beach. And then those people got on Facebook. Those people started calling their friends and texting, and more people started showing up. And within very short order, there were 100, 150 people gathered in this little park watching the water. And this is what they got to see. This is the famous shot that hit the news and in the media of the canoe emerging from the water for the first time in 1,200 years, being carried by Jim, Tammy, the volunteers, the dive team out of the water. You see one of our film crew in the background. And this is just a small selection of the crowd there. I threw in myself just to show that I'm not afraid to poke fun at myself. They actually made me put on a dry suit. I never again, if I can help it. The Ho-Chunk representative was following me around, poking me like I was the Pillsbury Doughboy for half the day. He thought it was hysterical. Over on the right, you see the mayor, who quite unexpectedly showed up in the middle of everything. But it's a good thing that she did, because we were able to mention that we had not really thought out how we were going to get it across town. And being the mayor, she just made a couple of phone calls for us. Out it comes. Bill Quackenbush with our director Overland in the background. So the tribal liaison was able to be the first person to touch the canoe and, to say hello to it as it comes back out. And then it was carefully sealed away, courtesy of the DNR. And by that point, Madison police who'd showed up at the mayor's request, making the neighborhood really wonder what was going on, because you tell police they need an escort for a 1,200-year-old canoe, just about everybody comes over to help. Okay. And across town it went to our safe facility. At this point, we had it out safely. Getting it into the tank safely was the next concern. After a lot of on-the-fly jury rigging and in combination with some carefully planned out elements, it was eventually lowered safely into that tank and then brought back out again after being sterilized so that we could do some cleaning and initial analysis on it. So here's Tammy working on it. And this is really how it was cleaned, just with brushes, sponges, and picks, taking out one little zebra mussel, one sand grain at a time until we had it pretty spotless. And then back in the tank it went into sterile water, eventually to be impregnated with a chemical called PEG, or polyethylene glycol. And that is going to take the water out of the canoe while also replacing that water. It will provide the structural stability that this not quite wood needs. After soaking for about 2 years in PEG, it'll be brought back out, shipped south to Texas to a large freeze drying facility where they will very quickly freeze dry it and drive the rest of the water out of the canoe. At that point, it'll be perfectly preserved in the PEG. And PEG is non-toxic. If you've ever had a Skittle, you've eaten it. So we're not really worried about the state of the wood after that. We had some help from UW. Very, very, very smart people over there at the Makerspace Engineering School. So they sent folks with a very, very expensive scanning device to take extremely detailed three-dimensional scans of the canoe in order to do a model. And I'll have one actually that you can print these things now. So I've got a little tiny version of this right here with me, and I'll show it when we're through here. After he finished the really expensive one, he said, let me try something, pulled out his iPhone. He has an iPhone, I believe it's 13 or 14, with the new ones with the LiDAR model attached. And in about 10 minutes, using his iPhone, he was able to do a lower resolution, full color model, 3D model of the canoe, just with his iPhone, which instantly made Jim state that we needed an iPhone for the office. It hasn't arrived yet. We're working on that. Film crew, again, this is Purple Onion observing the whole thing. The plan is to do a film on this at the History Center on the square when it's built here in a couple of years. And then, of course, it hit the media and it went everywhere. We assumed it would get a little local coverage, but we were not planning on the fact that this was a really nice, happy story in the middle of a global pandemic. People were just desperate for good news of any kind at this point, and it went international almost immediately. We were getting questions from Japan. We were on the news in Russia, Britain. We were making top 10 archaeological discoveries of the year in Britain. That's all right. That's unexpected, but here we go. Any press we can do, and the goal here is not just to say, hey, we found this great canoe, but to use the canoe as a launching point to talk about the Ho-Chunk and the native history of Wisconsin, because this is their canoe, this is their story. And so any attention that we can divert to the native presence in Wisconsin, the Madison area, fantastic. And we got some really great allies out of it. Well, one of the people watching the news was this guy right here in the middle, Governor Evers, who asked if he could come visit the canoe. We're absolutely, sir, you can. And he calls Tammy his favorite archaeologist. you came running up to her in the middle of a campaign. We came across her on State Street. They keep bumping into each other now. So Governor Evers, if you ever see this, thank you for everything you've done for us. In fact, we're hoping he'll be out with us for our next stage research, which I'll be talking about shortly. Now, coincidentally, at the same time that all this is going on, Bill Quackenbush, that Ho-Chunk liaison that you saw earlier, had been working on his own dugout canoe. In other words, trying to reuse traditional methods to make a canoe for Ho-Chunk youth to examine. And so everything just kind of came together all at once. And this past summer, with the canoe finished, he had Ho-Chunk youth come down and tribal representatives in the area, met on Lake Mendota, put the new dugout in on the North Shore, and Ho-Chunk youth sailed the dugout canoe, not just to the canoe discovery site, but down the Yahara River. They stopped at Safe to look at the 1,200-year-old canoe and then kept going down the Yahara all the way down to Beloit. So retracing a journey that ancestral Ho-Chunk would have made many, many times in the past. But now for the first time in centuries, that journey was undertaken again. We were privileged to be invited along for part of the first day so we could talk about the canoe discovery with them. So you see the dugout there kind of sandwiched in between modern kayaks and Tammy's aluminum canoe there in the Dawn Treader where the photo is being taken from. Everyone keeping each other stable while we hovered over the canoe site, and then down the Yahara they went after visiting our archival facilities to see the actual canoe. It handled very well, by the way. And then later, Jim and I are at Aztalan State Park, helping with some presentations and tours down there. And Jim gets a text message from Tammy. She's gone out on the lake again, and she sends him this. I'm not kidding. I found another canoe. About 100 yards from the first one, she's messing around down there, and there's a second one. But there's more. So this is canoe 2 off on the left-hand side of your screen. And what many people are not aware of, and you guys are going to get to see, some of the first to see it, is that she actually found 3. So canoe number 3 is not in near as good a shape as 1 and 2. It's just a fragment. But, you know, Jim said, here we go again. We're going to spend the rest of our lives in this little patch of Lake Mendota. And we took samples, sent them out for radiocarbon dating. Okay. So here's canoe number 1, nice and late woodland. Canoe number 2 blew us away. 3,000 something years old. It predates agriculture in Wisconsin. It predates pottery in Wisconsin. It predates mound building in Wisconsin. It's at the end of a hunting and gathering period we know as the Archaic. Okay. Canoe number 3 split the difference. So a middle woodland canoe, a period we call Hopewell. So before effigy mounds, before the bow and arrow, before corn is introduced, but after agriculture, after mound building, and after pottery arrives in Wisconsin. So we're a little surprised. And canoe 3, if canoe 1 was not completely wood, canoe 3 is barely wood at all at this point. And canoe 2 is in such bad shape. We're like, okay, we're not even going to, we will document it. We're going to have to leave it in place. But canoe 3 is fragile as it is. This is the oldest canoe ever found in the Midwest, one of the oldest in the United States. And it was even more exposed and even more rapidly deteriorating for a number of reasons than the first canoe. So, you know, again, deja vu, back to the lake. Our Dane County dive team wasn't available this time, so Tammy called on her Corps of volunteers to come out and help. So here they are with Jim. We were fleeing a storm that had driven us off the lake at this point, heading for her house so we could play with her cats. Again, the sample that she brought back up was sent to Forest Service, our Forest Products Lab, and along with other samples down there. And what we got back was, are you sure this wood? You really sure this is wood? This can't be wood. It's in terrible condition. So fortunately, the peg for the first canoe had not yet arrived. So we had some room to play with. There's still room in the tank for this one. All we had to do was reconfigure the peg concentration and reconfigure how we recovered the canoe. So there were lots of conferences between the divers and the boat, divers hand gesturing underwater. We had meetings in her house. We had meetings via Zoom. We talked to experts. How do we do this? it was decided eventually that the best thing to do was to put a rigid support under it, to kind of put it in a cradle like a taco shell. And instead of pulling it around under the water, we would put it on an air mattress, something soft that had a little flex and support to it that we could then tow in and not worry about air or the water pressure as it's moving through the water, impacting it in any way. Jim learned to dive specifically for this. So here he is, a little still from a video I took, giving a thumbs up after he's been down to see the canoe actually on the bottom of the lake for the first time. So recovery day 2, much nicer weather. Okay. Different technique. This time we had a very large crowd of tribal representatives. The media was alerted again. Smaller crowd on shore. I guess we were old hat for the neighborhood by then. Okay. And in they came. So it came up in its taco shell, was put on the air mattress, went off without a hitch, and then towed very, very slowly into shore and then brought in. So you will see here, however, that it did not come in as one piece. What we had thought was maybe 3 large pieces of canoe was actually several large pieces of canoe. And as fragile it was, just getting it to the safe facility fractured it further. And while I was just about to have a heart attack through half of this, the experts tell us this is not a problem, that once it is properly pegged and freeze dried, it can be reassembled, just put right back together and reshaped and mended almost like new, or like new for a 3,000-year-old canoe. Cleaning, here's Caitlin doing her best double-barreled cleaning technique. I had to be a little gentler. So a very light spray, and then instead of sponges and brushes, we had to be very, very careful, and just a toothpick here, a dab with a cloth there to get the sediment off of it, because when you touched it, it was soft, it was squishy, it was like a wet bagel. Ho-Chunk and other tribal groups helped us clean. They were on the boat, on a separate boat alongside the canoe when it came up out of the water for the first time. They were allowed to come up and touch, the canoe again to be the first to greet it as it came to shore. And we'll be working with Ho-Chunk in particular going forward, and hopefully with Bad River and other canoe experts in the tribal nations here. Because again, this is their heritage. So the context. Again, the first canoe is contemporary with the effigy builders. So this is a historic photo of a folded wing goose effigy up on the Black Hawk Country Club grounds. So you could see the canoe location from this site looking down. These are the people that made canoe number 1. So canoe number 1 made about 8,800 during the late woodland period. Forest Products tells us it's made out of white oak. Canoe number 2, this is our 3,000-year-old one, a late archaic, fashioned out of elm. And canoe number 3, our middle woodland canoe, out of elm. So we've got kind of a panorama of the first one looking above with the other end replicated to show you see the degraded end, which is all wrapped up in mummy bandages here. And I've put kind of a replica of the other end to show you its original length. It's about 15 feet long. Canoe number 2, the archaic canoe, about the same length, a little bit more degraded, came up in about 30-something different pieces when all was said and done. But we were able to refit most of them, and we created this little puzzle box. So this is going to guide us when we reassemble the canoe for display later. And you'll notice there's a big chunk missing out of the middle of it and out of the far side. These are anchor strikes. Unfortunately, it was fairly close to a marina, and people putting in their sailboats, fishing vessels, a good fishing spot, dropping anchors, they were punching them without knowing through this 3,000-year-old canoe down below. And that may be another reason the middle woodland canoe is not in great shape as well. All 3 canoes, if you look at them through time, so this is a global temperature curve. Over the last 10,000 years. And you see the temperature starts out about 10,000 years ago, very cold, and it gets warmer, warmer, warmer. So that's the end of the ice age, moving into what we call the hypsothermal, or peak temperature in between ice ages. And then the temperature starts to drop again as it heads towards the modern era. And then you'll notice that really anomalous line that goes almost straight up on the right side. That is global warming coming into play. If you plot out all 3 canoes, though, they all come in at a time period when temperatures kind of even out a little bit before dropping down again. So it's not at its driest, but it's not at its coolest and rainiest either. And the fact that all three date to this period tells us something about the lake levels. So what did Wisconsin look like at this point? In this area, mostly oak savanna. And that may have something to say about why the canoes are made out of the wood that they're made out of. The most recent, the one made in the coolest conditions, is made out of white oak. And if you've ever been in an oak forest, you'll know that oak trees tend to go more or less straight up. But if you're in an oak savanna, warmer and drier like this one, you'll see that oaks spread out sideways. The branches come out lower on the trunk of the tree. So if you're looking for a nice, big, straight piece of wood, a savanna oak is not the best. Elm, however, down in the bottomlands tends to grow straight and will preserve or will grow in wetter areas in a dry climate. So this is probably why they're picking elm further back in time, even though elm is a notoriously difficult wood to work. Here they are again. Looking back even further, could we find older canoes? Entirely possible. So the shading here shows you the period in which we think canoes were made. Way back about 10,000 years ago, people were making a very diagnostic stone tool called a trihedral adze. And we think that these are woodworking, specifically canoe making tools. They're fairly large. They're very thick in cross section. They look like an adze, a modern adze only made out of stone. They're made out of very tough volcanic rock, suitable for working very hard woods. We have really no idea what else people would be using them for, and canoes make sense, especially considering that 10,000 years ago was around the time that people began long distance trading. Like, you have to be able to get goods from point A to point B, and you can load a lot more of them on a canoe than you can carry them in your back. So Sissel Schroeder here on the right, my former advisor and professor here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, in conjunction with Tammy Thompson, is currently redoing that initial dugout canoe work that got her started in the first place. Sissel got one of those lovely iPhones, and they are now, with some grant money, going and taking radiocarbon and wood samples from all those canoes that are stored up in museums and local historical societies and separate clubs across Wisconsin. They've found over 60 of them at this point. So here's some examples of the top and middle. And you see they come in all different shapes and sizes. One of their old canoe on the bottom. We believe the one at the top is probably much newer. In fact, most of the canoes they're finding in the museums are probably very new. None of the radiocarbon dates that they have so far have come out anywhere near our Lake Mendota canoes, probably for the same reason that if we took our canoes out of the lake and put them in a separate club, again, they'd be dust in no time. Only the newer wood is going to be able to survive coming out and drying out and not being preserved in laboratory conditions. So we've got a little bias there. But they are studying the woods. They're finding that for the most part, the canoes are being made out of locally available wood. Once you get in northern Wisconsin, they're being made out of pine. Once you get into southern Wisconsin, they're being made out of oak or elm, depending on the time period. Some of them have holes where you can tie lines to. Some of them have thwarts. Some of them have pointed bows. Some of them have blunt bows. This is ongoing research, so we're still not entirely sure, where all this is going to lead or what it's going to tell us yet, but we're watching them very, very closely. What their research and our research is showing too is that historic accounts, written accounts of how these canoes were made, are largely being borne out. So this is an engraving, a colorized engraving made not from first-hand observation, but based on notes and accounts of European explorers in the 1500s and 1600s. Well, this is the artist's interpretation. It turns out they were pretty accurate here. In other words, fire was being used wherever possible. They had axes made out of ground stone. Basalt was a preferred one, very hard volcanic rock, but it doesn't have a very sharp edge to it. I've known people who've tried to chop down trees with replica stone axes, and they say it's like trying to beat the tree to death. A lot easier to girdle the tree, let it die, let it season for a little bit standing, and then you build a fire around the base, burn through, fell the tree, and again, you can see in the background, they're using fire to burn the limbs off and to take off some of the bark. And then the actual making of the canoe is just build a fire on top, wet down the sides, let the fire burn in a little bit, put out the fire, use a shell or a stone tool to scrape out the charcoal, rekindle the fire, making sure to always keep the outside of the canoe wet, and then just keep going, keep going, keep going. And they were very, very good at this. This is a close-up of canoe 1, and you could see the dark coloration. This is charring from burning, so it's been carbonized. And you could even see the ripples in it left behind when they're scraping the charcoal out of this canoe. So a little bit of tool marks. The white dots are there for the laser scanning. So those are not part of the canoe, and they've been removed since. The canoes themselves, at their thinnest, they were getting this down to just an inch, maybe 2 inches thick. So they knew, they were very, very skilled at this, knew how to go without going too far in and burning through the canoe. Some of these same engravings show the canoes being paddled, usually from a standing position, which is very interesting. We found one historic photo, again, this is from Florida, of a historic Native American paddling his dugout. And again, he's standing and then with a long paddle moving the canoe. So these were almost more like paddle boards than they were sit-down canoes, we believe, okay. Though you certainly could sit in them. Context again, this is the Rough Find location, just offshore on the south side of town. You've got the Black Hawk Country Club mounds, Spring Harbor mounds, and 3 known villages from the late woodland period off to the left around the springs themselves. The canoes were actually taken back to that beach, so we believe we may possibly have been returning the canoes to the beach they set sail from in the first place, or at least in the case of the first canoe. From a wider perspective, so the green dots are late woodland canoes, same age as the first canoe, or late woodland sites, same age as the first canoe. The brown dots are archaic sites, same age as the oldest canoe. And oh, I don't know. Can you see my cursor? Martha, can you nod? Okay, all right. Somebody's nodding. All right, so this is the rough area of the canoe location here. And you see it's kind of in a gap in between sites. So this could be the home village, or they could have been from this area around on Picnic Point. Okay. What's interesting though, if you look at this map, I've highlighted in red, there is a drop off or a kind of shelf down there. It's fairly level, and then you have a drop off that the divers and fishermen call the wall. This is where all the walleye and fish hang out. So you see boats hanging out there all the time too. The canoe was found just at the top of the wall, and this sort of ledge goes all the way around the lake. When the first canoe came up, we were asked, why is it there? Why is it in such deep water? And we thought, well, it must have sunk. And people said, well, if it sank, how are the net sinkers still in it? We thought, well, maybe they were attached to a net and the net got tangled in it. And there is a hole on one end of the first canoe. So Jim's initial theory was that perhaps there was a knot there in the wood and someone put their heel through it or their knee through it, and suddenly the canoe is sinking. Well, we had a major problem with that. Is when we got it back to the safe facility and put it in the tank, it floated. We needed it to sink. And it still wanted to bob to the surface and be a canoe, even with one end missing and a hole in it. So, all right. So how did it get down there? Well, the fact that we now have 3 canoes from 3 different time periods, all in more or less the same location, is saying something about Lake Mendota, not just the canoes. So here we are. So here's kind of a schematic of, here's the Dawn Treader up top. Here is canoe 3 down at the bottom. This is about the same depth that canoe 1 and 2 are at. We've got a diver here for scale. This line is the original lake level at settlement of Lake Mendota. It's been raised about 5 or 6 feet by the Tenny Lock and dams. Okay. This bench, if that bench is an old shoreline, if Lake Mendota at one point was much smaller and there was a beach that's now submerged, this would have been the shore, which would have put the canoes just offshore. So the top of the wall may be an old beach. And if that's the case, this level area right next to it might be a village. In other words, these may have been pulled up on a beach. The experts we're talking to that are studying the history of Lake Mendota and the lakes region say that if a drought is prolonged enough here, okay, the Yahara River will actually shut down. It doesn't have enough of a headwater to supply the lakes if conditions are just right. At that point, Lake Mendota will start to evaporate, the water levels will drop. Okay. If then we have a very, very wet winter, heavy snowfall, the Yahara will resume flow and the lake will rapidly refill. So this is our current theory right now, subject to change, is that what we're seeing is a period in that window of time where the temperature isn't really declining, but it isn't getting any warmer either, and it's just sort of fluctuating back and forth. There may have been something distinct about Wisconsin's climate at that point that was causing Lake Mendota, or the lake for the Yahara River, to shut off, come back on, shut off, come back on. So there would be periods where this bench area was available for settlement, and the periods when it was rapidly reflooding. And any canoes left on that beach or on that bench could have been lost over the winter. Water comes up, people return to that location, and their village is gone. The canoes are gone, the entire village is gone. So that's our current theory. And we're going to test it. So this is what's coming up next. And I'm looking at this at some dread because I'm not a fan of the cold and the ice. But this coming Monday, we are going to be out on the ice up above the canoe location with the Ho-Chunk Nation and with some experts in ground penetrating radar. Bill Quackenbush will be back. And we're going to be pulling a radar sled back and forth on the ice over this possible village location and where the rest of the canoes are coming up. We're going to see if we can find more canoes that way. We're going to see if we can find any indications of a village that way. For example, garbage pits or storage pits, house basins that may be under the sediment down there. And we're going to see what we can see. So we have no idea what to expect, but if anything, this site has just kept surprising us and delighting us. So we have our fingers crossed. Personally, I'll be happy just not to fall into the lake. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen, if I can figure out how, and ask if there are any questions. Okay, chat. Okay. My goodness, let's head on down here. Okay. Where in Mendota were the canoes found? All right, so South Shore, I did put up the map. So that is not far off of Black Hawk Country Club, just kind of between the Black Hawk Country Club and Eagle Heights. So they were about 100 yards offshore, again, just at the top of that bench. Story behind the speedboat. It is a pretty amazing story. The speedboat, actually, I was really amazed to find that they had a 3D model of that. The speedboat ties into effigy mounts, of all things. Again, it was a poorly conceived idea. So the stories I've heard is it was a young man invited his friends. He made this homemade speedboat, and they're showing off when the engine cuts out suddenly, and a wave, the wake that was following them, washed over the boat, filled it, sank it, and all drowned. The thing is, not long before that, a man by the name of Leland Cooper had excavated a water spirit effigy mound on the west shore of Lake Mendota, and a tribal delegation had come by and had not been happy with this. And when the sinking happened, the media picked it up as Indian curse kills 5 on Lake Mendota. And so the clippings were all cut out and put in our records to do with that mound group. And I'd always wondered, gosh, I wonder if Tammy ever found that speedboat. She's like, I did. Look, we've got a model of it. Well, of course you did. So, you know, it has an archaeological tie-in beyond being a shipwreck there. The canoes, were they found only because they were recently uncovered? That's our theory. So we have been wondering about that. So what's going on with the lake now that these canoes are suddenly coming out? Again, Tammy's been back and forth all over this lake, seeing what's down there. And there are things, the speedboat, there are cars, there's a weird concrete like bubble habitat that's down there that you can go into. So part of some experiment, I believe, from the university way back in the day. And suddenly there are canoes. So what's going on? She has some contacts with the DNR that are theorizing that this is wake boats. In other words, the ones that are going and making the big weights so they can pull people behind them to kind of paddleboard and surfboard. And that these very powerful motors that are making the wakes and the waves are actually disturbing the water column to a much greater depth than previous boat motors were on the lake. And so they're churning up the sediment and roiling it up and beginning to erode the lake bottom at that point. So these canoes, the upland ends, oh, I've got our little model here. All right. So here's canoe one. And so this is the end that was buried. You can see it's in really good condition, except for that odd hole. This is the upslope end, and it is the end that was fragmented that we had to wrap for protection. So when it was found, it was sticking out about like this. So just with that upper end coming out. So it began to erode this direction. The same for the other two canoes. We think that the wake boats are beginning now to churn up the water, and the anchors going in and out are not helping very much there, because the sediment is what's protecting the canoes from the anchors coming down as well. All right, so were canoes ever sunk intentionally for winter storage? Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, when she said that there were stones in them, that was one of the first things I said was, how big are they? Because we do know that Native peoples would cache canoes in the winter. If you put them underwater for a winter season, they actually preserve. It's like cold storage, and then you can haul them back out in the spring. So you'd put large stones to weigh them down and keep them from floating away and moving. So thought it was, okay, maybe someone cached a canoe and didn't get back to it, but the little net sinkers are just not big enough for that. And it was just one little pile of them just calmly down there. Okay. Someone asked, can we see the 3D model? Oh yeah, well, here it is. So don't ask me how they do this. I went over to the maker space. There were all these kids that looked like they were about 10 years old doing things that I did not understand at all. Over there, so many complicated machines. But apparently he could put that model in some machine and then put it into a 3D printer and spit out little tiny canoes for us. They said, in fact, that if we could get them a piece of oak big enough, they had a computer controlled router that would just completely remake the canoe for us, and boy, is that tempting. We haven't taken them up on that yet, but all different sizes. So we've got, for example, just this is the preserved end so that we could get a better look at that hole that's through it in some of the tool markings on the inside. He's having a little trouble. We could not, unfortunately, flip the canoe over. So you're seeing the computer trying to figure out what's going on because it can't see this stripe on the bottom. Once it's stabilized and freeze dried, it will be sturdy enough to flip, and we'll be able to do a full scan of it at this point. They have, with what they've got, been able to plug in some computer algorithms, and they tell us that it can hold, I believe it's about 160, 200 pounds or so. So enough for one person and some fish, or maybe two smaller folks to get in. So not going to hold too much, but it'll hold enough. So one person fishing will be just fine. Depth of canoe one, the same as all of them. I believe they're around 25 feet down, which for Wisconsin waters is quite deep to find a canoe. Do they stand to paddle the canoes? We believe so. The replica that Bill made of the Ho Chunk, they were able to sit. That canoe is a little deeper in hold than the ones we have, though. So ours are probably more of a paddleboard type. The ones Bill's made are probably more suited. His style is probably a little bit more suited for long distance transport and trade. Sissel and Tammy are finding what we believe may be river transport vessels. They're much longer than ours, almost double the length right now. So again, all of our canoes are around 15 feet. We believe, and many of the canoes they're finding their samples are about the same length. So we may have a size discrepancy between canoes that are made on lakes and then canoes that are made for river travel. We've got longer canoes. Will you do another Zoom for the new possible village? Oh, you know we will. Yeah, we have to talk about the canoe all the time. In fact, you are lucky. If this was Jim, you would have heard so many canoe puns right now. I see Alex laughing. He knows, he understands. Yeah, what's canoe with you? All the canoes that's fit to print. Yeah, yeah. We will definitely be keeping everybody up to date on what comes up. As if we find a submerged village, that's also going to be a first for Wisconsin and a very rare thing for the Great Lakes in general. With respect to the theory of the sunken village, whether or not ground penetrating radar tells you anything, are there plans to dive there? Oh, absolutely. Yeah, so once we've done the radar, that's the next thing we'll have to do is we'll have to ground truth. Jim's not really up for diving under ice. Tammy would probably do it in a heartbeat, but I don't know if we're going to let her. The problem with Lake Mendota is it's not exactly a clean lake. Those of you that live here know that the water's pretty clear right at the first of the year, and then the algae blooms, the sediment comes in, and it's like mud. When they were trying to excavate Canoe 3, Tammy at one point said it was like diving in coffee. You could barely see your hands in front of your face. So it was real hard work there in June. But the hope is that come this spring, once the ice is off, but before the water begins to lose visibility again, she and Jim are probably going to be straight in the water, double checking all of our targets, seeing what we can find down there, and then doing more survey looking for more canoes. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if she didn't find them. If the DNR is correct and we are now starting to erode an ancient shoreline, I have a feeling they're going to be popping out fairly frequently here. The canoe in Mirror Lake at Ishnala was found near the store sunken with stones. Reminds me of that. Yeah, and that is in fact one of the canoes that she and Sissel have looked at very recently. So they've been up to Ishnala. They've done 3D models and scans and taken samples for that. So we should know pretty soon how old that canoe is and what type of wood it's made out of. Okay. So keep an eye out for anything that Sissel Schroeder, so she gives Zoom presentations sometimes. And, in fact, Wisconsin Historical Society website. In about a month, Google her name, because she did give a talk for the Charles E. Brown Association. We did tape that. So if you want to hear all the news that she's got from the onshore canoe studies, you will be able to see that, watch that video on the Wisconsin Historical Society website here in about a month. So make notes for yourself there. Has the peg supply problem been resolved? Yes, I believe it has. It hasn't been added yet, but we do have it. So they're doing the calculations to see how much they need to add. Any dives on Madison's 3 other lakes? Not yet. And personally, if it were me, I'd send them to Lake Wingra. Tammy refuses. She says it's instant ear infection in Lake Wingra. But it's a little lake with a strong native presence, and not as much damage from watercraft, a lot of silting, and I have a feeling there are canoes from all time periods happily preserved under that mud. So I would like to see Wingra done. She says no. But again, the idea we will eventually begin expanding out. And we're also having contacts from divers in other lakes in Wisconsin saying they believe they've spotted one here or there. So we're following up on those as well. Who's doing the conservation treatment? That's being done here at the Society by our curators. So they've had a crash course in peg and wood conservation. We also have some experts advising us from Texas and other areas, North Carolina, helping us out with exactly how this is done. People have been through the process with their own canoes before. And is that area going to be protected from more erosion by restricting access? That's a political question right there. This is a pretty wealthy neighborhood, and fairly wealthy people have boats. So the question is, can we come up with a way to protect the canoes and make sure that that marina gets to stay where it is? So hasn't been brought up in any official capacity yet, though we certainly have discussed it. Is there anything we can do, or is the hope to, maybe there are other canoes that will remain buried and this is a fluke, but so something we do need to explore a little further. Question from Brandy: is there a way the state might consider buying back and protecting the Mendota Lakeshore areas over time in order to better preserve the historic and archaeological areas, as well as clean up some of the pollution? As much as I would love that, I think Kat's well out of the bag there. This is pricey real estate. And I think if, people would like to donate lakeshore properties to the state, they'd probably be more than happy to take it. But the ability to purchase, I think, is going to be really, really limited at this point. It is something even the city and the county know should happen, however, because there are flooding concerns, there are water quality concerns. And, as we saw from the floods that impacted Pope Farm themselves a few years ago, the drainage situation in the Madison area is not ideal because we've lost a little too much wetland here. So if there's any way to restore it, I would be all wholeheartedly behind it, but I think it'd be very difficult to achieve. Okay, do you have links for joining? Yes, and I see Martha's done that.
Yeah, I think Janie posted those. I think we're going to kind of wrap it up. Maybe
Okay.
one more question.
I think
Is
we
there
were,
one more?
I think we were done.
Okay,
Trying
wonderful.
to blow through these.
Again, I want to thank you all for coming and let you know that we have recorded Amy's presentation. It'll be posted on the Friends of Pope Farm website later today. Please come out to the Conservancy. There's always something to see. Look for other programs that we'll be offering throughout the year. And Amy, thank you so much. This was a wonderful program.
Okay, thank you so much. And I will see y'all later. Right, bye. Thanks for coming.
Hi, everybody.
Very interesting.
Bye.
That was a great program.